And in a particular way today, we're grateful to God for this anniversary. 475 doesn't come to the mouth easy. If you were looking for a Latin word to try to describe it, because that's how sometimes we mark anniversaries, a centennial or a bicentennial, you have to kind of put some words together. And the closest you can come up with is dodrincinquentennial, which means a quarter century short of 500 years. In any case, no matter how you say it, 475 years is a long time. People mark anniversaries for two reasons. One is to look backward, and the other is to look ahead. I think we know pretty well the elements of our history, but let me review a little bit of it anyways. St. Angela Merici founded the Ursuline Sisters today, November 25th, in the year 1535 in Brescia, Italy, a town in the northern part of Italy. It was the feast of St. Catherine of Alexandria, a saint from the early 4th century. Catherine was renowned in the 16th century for her learning and for her spousal commitment to Christ, and also for her strength in resisting temptations to lure her away from her faith. From this foundation in northern Italy, the community spread quickly through much of Europe, especially to Germany and France. For our foundation, it was the French that were the most significant. Ursulines were the first to come from France to North America when they landed in Quebec in 1639. They were the first to come to what is now the United States when they landed in New Orleans in 1727. They were among the first in the state of Ohio when they came to Cincinnati in 1845. They were the first in northern Ohio when they came to Cleveland in 1850. And our community was the first to come to the Youngstown area when they came here in 1874. What's the source of inspiration to this kind of life of prayer and service? The writings of St. Angela give us an insight about this. There are several themes that present themselves again and again in her writings. I want to focus on two of them. One is God. Nothing like stating the obvious. For St. Angela, everything is rooted in God and God's revelation to us in Christ and in the power of the Spirit. The primary way that God chose to reveal himself to us is by becoming human, by taking on flesh in Jesus. Angela dedicated her own life and that of her daughters to a single-minded, and actually we might say single-hearted focus on God. Angela wrote that we ought to have our only refuge at the feet of Jesus. And so in this way, St. Angela was a contemplative. The second theme I want to highlight is generous service on behalf of God's people. Contemplation was not the only way St. Angela wanted to be in relation to God. Angela did not choose monasticism that was typical of religious life for women in her day. She was involved in the world. We know from her writings that she had a lot of connections with church leaders, with businessmen, with affluent widows of the area, and both of those groups served as her benefactors. She also had connections with young women, some of whom were victims of sexual abuse. She leveraged these human resources to begin to transform the lives of young women. Today we would call that networking. What I think Angela understood from the depths of her hearts was a sense of right relations. I think her logic went something like this. We are creatures who are made in the image and likeness of God. We are imago Dei. The very nature of God is triune, to be in relation. Consequently, as creatures, we are those who are inherently in relation to others. This is a thoroughly Christian way of thinking, and I believe it was part of the inspiration to help her network with all of those others. When Jesus prays at the end of the last discourse in John's Gospel, we have an insight into the kind of relation that Jesus shares with God and with the rest of humanity. There is a unity between the Father and the Son, but also a distinction between them. The love they share in common is not closed in on itself, but is open to the whole world and freely given to others. Who are the others? Well, the immediate others in that gospel, of course, are the disciples who are gathered with Jesus. But notice how he prays for those who will come to believe in him through their words, those who proclaim his good news and his saving message. Christ makes a promise here that his disciples will share in God's life and that they will be caught up in a unity of love. Now, one of the things I always say to my students, this is not God's plan B after Adam and Eve had made everything awful and God had to say, okay, now what are we going to do? Rather, it was always God's plan of salvation to save humanity from the foundation of the world. The promise made by God, revealed in Jesus and the power of the Spirit, is a promise that we believe will be fulfilled. Angela echoes in her writings the insight of St. Paul. The good work that God has begun in us will be brought to completion. One way to imagine God's plan of salvation is to think of a pattern of exitus reditus. It's a Latin phrase for exit and return. Everything comes from God, and everything ultimately will return to God in the fullness of time. We who live in history live somewhere between that beginning and the final end, and we have this one opportunity in our lives to participate in this saving mystery of God. We know this mystery because it has been handed on to us. Others will know it to the extent that we are faithful in handing it on to them. And that's the challenge of each generation of Christians. We take up the task again in each era to be faithful to the promise that God has made for us. It's not always easy. Each age has its difficulties as well as its rewards. So our anniversary today is only in part about the past. The rest is about the future, looking ahead. I think there are some parallels between the time of St. Angela and the day in which we live. She lived at the time of the Reformation. We live in the early 21st century. But listen to some of the issues that were part of her context. There was tension in the church and a call for reform. There were disagreements about the language in which the church should pray. There were multiple visions of how religious life ought to be lived. There was a lack of respect for life issues, and especially the sexual abuse of young women. There were issues about authority in the church. Do these sound familiar? As we celebrate this 475th anniversary, we rejoice and give thanks for the many blessings that have come our way through the whole economy of salvation and Christianity, and in St. Angela and her daughters. We also recommit ourselves to fidelity to God's saving mystery as it has been given to us in Christ and taken up by St. Angela and her daughters. It's not enough to live in the glory of the past days. Each of us is called to take up this task again in our own day, so that 25 years from now we can be celebrating our 500th anniversary